So how do we actually define those permissions, right, for users? Once we've added our users, one for each person in our organization, we're actually going to have to give them specific permissions. We do this through things called IAM policies. So they allow or deny permissions to AWS services and resources, and they can be assigned to IAM users. They can also be assigned to groups, as we'll discuss. But yeah, IAM policies enable you to customize users' level of access to resources. This could be S3 buckets. This could be EC2 instances, right? You want them to have access just to this bucket, do it through a custom policy. You want this user to only be able to start EC2 instances but not stop them. You could do it through your own custom policy. When designing these policies, a best practice, right, an industry standard is to follow the principle of least privilege. Give your users, give those people in your organization, give those apps the minimum permissions possible. What do we mean by minimum permissions possible? Whatever they need, the minimum that they need to perform their tasks, to get their job done. Don't give them anything beyond that. Once you start pushing for more privileges outside of what they need and more for like what they're asking for, what they want, sometimes users will be like, oh, I hate having to do this, right? It's annoying having to go to this person to get access to this information. Well, if it's not going to, hinder their workflow, hinder their job, then make them, right, go through those extra steps if it's in the sake of security. So when you give people minimum permission, you say, hey, here's what you need to get your job done. If you want anything else, right, you're going to have to go through another process, through another person in order to get access to that data or privileges. That's a good idea, right, when it comes to locking things down and making sure that there's no security vulnerabilities. So as a specific user, right, we've already discussed this. If I'm a developer and I'm on a certain team, maybe I don't need access to data from all the teams, right, in my 100-person software team. If I don't need access to, for example, the front end, right, and I'm only working on the back end for a certain application, then don't give me permissions, right, for the front end, because I might go in there and mess things up. So it's just preventing vulnerabilities, preventing mistakes, right, preventing anything from going wrong, right, by just following this principle of least privilege. Just give people what they need, not necessarily, right, what's most convenient. Security, right, and convenience, they kind of don't go hand in hand. All right, so little example of what an IAM policy might look like, especially if you're doing like command line stuff, right? If you're assigning things programmatically, then this is what the actual code for that policy could look like. So let's return to the coffee shop. So suppose the owner has to create an IAM user for a new cashier. The cashier only needs access to the receipts in an S3 bucket called AWS Doc Example bucket. So the IAM policy is allowing a specific action within a specific service, in this case, Amazon S3. So here's the resource name, right? We have S3, the name of the actual bucket. We only want to give them permissions to do this action. List object means they'll be able to see the object inside the bucket. They'll be able to list them out. And then effect means allow, right? And then we see the version of this policy, etc. So the policy also mentions a specific bucket ID, right? So they're not going to have access to all the buckets, just this particular one. When the owner attaches this policy to the cashier's IAM user, they're going to be allowed to view all the objects in that particular bucket. This format, for those of you that are curious, it's called JSON, very common in APIs on the internet, especially when you're transmitting data. JSON is one of the most popular ways to format it. In the case of IAM policies in AWS, they also follow that JSON format. JSON stands for JavaScript Object Notation. All right, so now suppose that the coffee shop has hired a few more cashiers. Instead of assigning permissions to each individual IAM user, the owner places the users into an IAM group. So an IAM group, that's going to enable you to work with multiple users at a time. You can certainly assign policies one person at a time, but if you're in an organization of 200 people and being able to partition them into maybe just 5 or 6 groups, you're going to be way more efficient when it comes to assigning policies. So instead of assigning policies to each and every person, each and every user, you can do it through groups. So it's a collection of IAM users that share the same permissions. Instead of assigning permissions again to individual users, you can attach it to a group, which is going to make it way, way more efficient when it comes to managing, dozens, hundreds, potentially thousands of users, right? With similar access needs. So here's an example of how this might work in the coffee shop. Instead of assigning permissions to cashiers one at a time, you can create the cashiers group. So every time you need to modify, right, you got 3 cashiers in this example. Instead of going to each one of them and assigning the same policies over and over again, you just go to this upper level, right, and just say, hey, for all the cashiers, all the users in this group, you're going to use these policies. So when you change the policies here, it's going to cascade down to all the users. So assigning IAM policies at the group level also makes it easier to adjust permissions, just like I said. You make a change, right? It'll cascade down. So for example, if a cashier becomes an inventory specialist, the owner can remove them from the cashier's IAM group and move them to another group called inventory specialist. So it's not just changing the individual group, it's also transferring people between groups is a lot easier, right? So it's going to make it easier to assign those policies and to make changes, right, to particular users' permissions. So this ensures that employees have only the permissions they need, right? Remember the principle of least privilege. So what if a coffee shop employee hasn't switched jobs permanently? What if they're just rotating to different workstations throughout the day? AWS has a solution for this as well. So if you want temporary permissions, temporary access, you can do this via IAM roles. So what is an IAM role? It's an identity that allows users, applications, or AWS services. Remember, it's not always just humans that represent users. It could be other software resources such as databases, instances, etc. To assume specific permissions temporarily. So this is the key of IAM roles, that it's temporary without requiring long-term credentials. So before an IAM user, application, or service can assume an IAM role, they must be granted permissions to switch to the role. So you also can provide permissions to who can switch to which roles. So IAM roles are ideal for situations in which access to services or resources need to be granted temporarily, just like in the case of a worker, right, who might take on different roles, wear different hats in the company. Well, you can do the same thing through AWS roles. So in the coffee shop, an employee rotates to different workstations during the day. So we're bringing back that coffee shop metaphor. So depending on the staffing of the coffee shop, this employee might perform several duties, right? Maybe they're cashiers. Maybe they're also inventory specialists. Maybe they even work on the online site, right? Processing online orders. And so forth. So when the employee needs to switch to different tasks, they give up their access to one workstation and gain access to the next workstation. So essentially you're changing your hat, right? You're taking off your hat for cashier and you're putting on your inventory specialist hat. So if you need to switch between different permissions, IAM roles is definitely the way to go, especially when it comes temporarily, right? So the employee can easily switch between workstations, but at any given point in time, they can have access to only a single workstation. So this is the same with roles. You could say, oh, this person can have developer roles, but can also have security roles, right? Maybe it's a particular engineer that handles both or needs access to both. So they can switch back and forth, right? So temporarily be the developer and then be the security officer in a different situation. So here's a little bit of a diagram, right? Again, changing of hats. So first, the coffee shop owner grants the employee permissions to the cashier and inventory roles, so they can switch between those two workstations. They can only have one of those roles at a time. The employee begins their day by assuming the cashier role. This grants them access to the cash register system. If they need to later on switch, right, they can certainly do that. So wearing one hat at a time. So it's the same with IAM roles, right? If you want to have a different subset of permissions, but you don't want to have to actually like switch the user between like different groups, you can assign them roles and permissions to access particular roles. So roles, one at a time. So multi-factor authentication. So this is something a lot of us are familiar with. So if you want to add an extra layer of security to your users, you definitely want to enable MFA for them. I can tell you, working for a DoD contractor, MFA was set up day one for my user account, IAM user account. So what is multi-factor authentication? It's a security feature that requires users to provide 2 or more forms of authentication before accessing an account. So when I log in through my computer, I might also have to do some authentication on my phone, for example, right? Most people nowadays also have a smartphone. So typically, when we're talking about MFA or 2FA, 2FA is two-factor authentication. It's typically going to be a computer, some kind of device, right? And then also a smartphone is definitely one of the most common setups. So you might have experience with MFA if you've ever had to provide not just a password, but also second form of authentication when signing in to some of your favorite websites. So maybe you're signing into Amazon or eBay, right? When you're going to go shopping. When you get that random code sent to your phone, it's that extra layer of security, right? If a hacker is able to get your password and username on one computer, they still would somehow need to get their hands on your phone in order to get that random authentication code, right? So it's just an extra check to make sure that you are indeed the person trying to log in and you're not some malicious attacker. So multi-factor authentication, right? You have your username, you have your password, you enter it, good old fashioned, right? It works fine on its own, but if you want extra security, then you might need to go to a second device, right? To add that extra confirmation that, hey, I am indeed the person that's trying to sign in. I'm not just someone who stole the credentials. So this could be a security key, it could be another device. It could even be an MFA app, right, on a device such as a smartphone. There's a lot of different MFA apps nowadays. All of them get the pretty much the same job done in terms of, hey, you logged in here. I need you to also confirm that you have access to this other device, this other trusted device, so that I know that, hey, this is the person, right, because they have both devices. All right, so next up, we'll be discussing AWS organizations.